I always thought betrayal was something that happened to other people, the kind of tragedy you read about in books or see in movies, not the life you build with someone for 18 years. But when I picked up my husband's phone that night, I realized my entire life had been a lie. The man I trusted, the man I built a home with, had been cheating on me. Not for a month, not for a year, but for almost a decade. 8 years of deception, 8 years of sharing my life with a stranger, and worst of all, I never saw it coming. David and I were in New Zealand, visiting my niece. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to reconnect, but from the moment we arrived, something felt off. He was distant, barely speaking to me, glued to his phone every chance he got. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was overthinking. We had been through so much over the years, losses, stress, work pressure. Maybe this was just another rough patch, but deep down, something told me it was more than that. The final straw came on the third day. That morning, he left for a run without his phone. It was unusual. David never went anywhere without it. I stared at it for a long time, my pulse hammering. I had never been the kind of wife who checked her husband's messages. We had always had trust, or at least I thought we did. But the past few days had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, one I couldn't shake. My hands were trembling as I reached for the device. The screen lit up at my touch, no password required. That alone felt like a sign, as if fate itself had decided I needed to see the truth. I opened his messages, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Work chats, old conversations with friends, and then I saw it. A thread with his best friend in Italy, a name I knew well. I almost scrolled past it, thinking it would be harmless. But as I skimmed through the messages, my stomach dropped. I finally told Rachel about Nelson, David had written. Well, part of it. She still doesn't know about the others. The words blurred in front of my eyes. I read it again, hoping I had misunderstood, but the meaning didn't change. My hands felt ice cold as I kept scrolling. Still seeing him? His friend had asked. Yeah, can't help it, but I felt empty after. Nelson isn't Rachel. My breath hitched. I had been bracing myself for the possibility of an affair, but this was something else. Nelson wasn't some random woman. Nelson was a man, and David had been sleeping with him. I nearly dropped the phone, my vision tunneled, the world shrinking down to the words on the screen. I wanted to stop reading, to pretend I hadn't seen any of it, but I couldn't. My fingers had a mind of their own, pulling up more messages, more proof that my marriage was nothing more than an illusion. David had been cheating on me for years, with multiple people, with men and women. My husband, the man I had shared a bed with for almost 2 decades, had lived a double life right under my nose. Everything clicked into place. The distance, the late nights, the constant trips for work that never made sense, the excuses, the lack of intimacy, the feeling that I had been slowly losing him without knowing why. I had been so blind, so trusting, and he had let me be. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the bed to steady myself. I wanted to scream, cry, throw the phone against the wall, but I did nothing. Instead, I just sat there, staring at the messages, frozen in place. David came back from his run 20 minutes later, sweat dripping down his forehead, a casual smile on his face like nothing had changed. Like my world hadn't just imploded. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly, then reached for his phone. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to confront him right away. I wasn't going to give him the chance to twist the truth, to manipulate me with more lies. No, I needed to be smart. Because if he had spent the past 8 years betraying me, then I was going to spend the next few weeks making sure he regretted every second of it. I didn't confront him that night. I wanted to. God, I wanted to scream, throw his phone in his face, demand to know how he could lie to me for so long. But I didn't. I couldn't. If I was going to get through this, I needed a plan. If I let my emotions take over, he'd find a way to spin the narrative, make himself the victim, and after 8 years of lies, the last thing I was going to do was let him control the story. So I waited. I spent the rest of the trip pretending nothing was wrong. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every time David touched me, every time he smiled, every time he acted like the devoted husband he had pretended to be for years, I had to fight the urge to recoil. At night, when he slept beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for the signs I had missed. They were all there, I just hadn't wanted to see them. On the flight home, David leaned over and squeezed my hand. "This trip was nice," he said. "I feel like we needed this." I forced myself to nod, my throat burning with the effort of keeping my composure. Once we landed, I went into full investigation mode. If David had been lying to me for 8 years, I needed to know exactly how deep the betrayal ran. I started small, checking bank statements, phone records, email accounts. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were hotel receipts dating back years, expensive dinners in cities he had supposedly traveled to alone. There were cash withdrawals I couldn't explain, gifts I had never received. But the worst was the email account. He had one I didn't know about, and when I finally got into it, my entire body went cold. Hundreds of emails, conversations with Nelson with others, photos, flights booked for weekends I thought he was away for work. It wasn't just that he had been cheating, it was that he had built an entire secret life behind my back, and all this time, I had been the fool who believed he was faithful. I printed everything, every receipt, every email, every message. I wasn't going to let him weasel out of this. He could cry, beg, make excuses, but the evidence was undeniable. A week after we got home, I finally confronted him. I waited until dinner, until he was relaxed, comfortable, his guard down. Then I pulled out the folder I had put together and dropped it on the table between us. David frowned, setting his fork down. "What's this?" I folded my arms. "Why don't you open it and find out?" He hesitated, then reached for the folder. I watched as he flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from confusion to realization, to something that almost looked like fear. I didn't say a word. I wanted him to sit in the silence, to absorb the weight of what he had done. After a long moment, he let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. "Rachel?" he started, but I held up a hand. "Don't," I said. "Don't start with excuses. Don't try to manipulate me. Just tell me the truth. How long?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "Rachel, please." "How long?" He exhaled. 8 years. Even though I had known, hearing him admit it still felt like a knife to the chest. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay calm. "So everything was a lie? Our marriage? Our life together? All those times you told me you loved me?" "No," he said quickly. "No, I did love you. I still do." I let out a bitter laugh. "You don't get to say that, not after this. Love doesn't look like this, David." He shook his head. I was confused. I didn't plan for this to happen. "Oh, so you accidentally cheated for 8 years?" I snapped. "Accidentally booked hotels, accidentally created secret email accounts, accidentally lied to me every single day." His face twisted. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I slammed my hands on the table. "But you did, over and over again, and you didn't stop." He dropped his gaze, saying nothing. The silence stretched between us. I had spent so long loving this man, trusting him, believing we were partners, and now sitting across from him, I felt nothing but disgust. Finally, I spoke. "Pack your things," I said. "I want you out of this house." David's head snapped up. "Rachel, wait, we can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. I made mistakes, but I love you." "No, you don't." I stood up. "If you did, you wouldn't have done this. I deserve better than you, and I won't waste another second of my life on someone who spent 8 years treating me like a fool." His mouth opened, then closed. He looked away as if searching for something to say that would change my mind, but there was nothing. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him sitting there in the wreckage of his own making. David didn't leave that night. I knew he wouldn't. Men like him don't just walk away when they lose control. They cling, they manipulate, they twist reality until you start questioning everything. I didn't give him the chance. I locked myself in the guest bedroom and lay awake, listening to the silence of the house that suddenly felt foreign to me. I had shared this space with him for years, filled it with memories, laughter, and trust. Now it felt like a crime scene. A place where I had been played, deceived, made to look like a fool, while he lived his double life right under my nose. The next morning, I got up before him. I didn't want to see his face, hear his pathetic excuses, or watch him pretend to be remorseful. I grabbed my keys and left the house without a word, my mind set on one thing. I needed more answers. Knowing he had cheated wasn't enough. I needed to understand the extent of his betrayal, every ugly detail he had kept hidden. I drove to a quiet cafe, ordered coffee I wouldn't drink, and pulled out my phone. I had already gone through his emails and bank statements, but I wanted to dig deeper. I searched for Nelson's social media. His profile was private, but his profile picture was a smug-looking man in his late 30s, dark hair, sharp suit, the kind of person who looked like he always got what he wanted. I scrolled through mutual connections and found a few names I recognized, David's coworkers, people I had met at company events. That realization hit me like a brick. David hadn't just been lying to me, he had built an entire network of people who either knew or enabled his affair. How many of them had smiled in my face while knowing the truth? I needed to see him. I needed to see Nelson, face to face, to hear from his own mouth what he was to my husband. I wasn't naive enough to believe he'd tell me everything, but I didn't care. I just wanted to watch his reaction when I confronted him. I found the address linked to one of his old posts, a bar downtown. It was a long shot, but I had nothing to lose. When I arrived, the place was mostly empty, the kind of spot people went to for expensive cocktails and hushed conversations. I sat at the bar, ordered a drink I wouldn't touch, and waited. An hour passed before I saw him. He walked in with the confidence of someone who thought he owned the world, his suit impeccable, his smile effortless. He didn't see me at first. I watched as he greeted the bartender, then checked his phone, probably waiting for David to text him. I stood up and walked straight to him. Nelson. He turned, eyebrows raised. His gaze flicked over me, and for a moment I saw the recognition flash in his eyes. Rachel, right? He recovered quickly, his expression smoothing into something unreadable. I was wondering when you'd come find me. I clenched my fists, every nerve in my body screaming at me to slap the smug look off his face. You've been sleeping with my husband. He tilted his head. Not recently. My stomach twisted. How long? Nelson sighed as if he was bored already. I don't know, Rachel. Years, off and on. It wasn't serious at first, but David has a way of coming back. He glanced at the bartender and gestured for a drink, as if this was just another conversation for him. Were you the only one? My voice was steady, but inside I was crumbling. He smirked. Oh, Rachel. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. David was never just yours. You know that now, don't you? My hands shook. I wanted to scream, to break something, but I refused to let him see me shatter. Instead, I took a slow breath. Did you love him? Nelson's smirk faltered, just for a second. He hesitated, then shrugged. Does it matter? It did, more than I wanted to admit. If David had just been using him, the way he had used me, it meant something different. But if he had loved Nelson, if he had built something real with him, while lying to my face for 8 years, it meant I had never even been a choice. I had just been the backup plan. I swallowed the lump in my throat. What does he want from you now? Nelson studied me for a moment, then shook his head. Honestly, I don't think even he knows. He took a sip of his drink. But if you're looking for some grand explanation, you won't get it. David lies to himself as much as he lies to you. He always has. I wanted to hate Nelson. I wanted him to be the villain, the one who ruined my marriage. But staring at him, listening to him talk about David like he was something broken, I realized he wasn't the real problem. David was. Nelson was just another person caught in his web of lies. I stepped back, suddenly feeling exhausted. Stay away from him. Nelson laughed softly. That's cute, Rachel. You still think you have control over him. I didn't answer. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I had what I came for. I had confirmation that David's betrayal was worse than I could have imagined. Now, I just had to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I didn't go home right away. After leaving the bar, I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind was a whirlwind of everything Nelson had said, everything David had done, the way Nelson had spoken about my husband, the easy arrogance in his voice, the complete lack of guilt. It was infuriating, but beneath my anger, there was something worse, a sickening, gnawing feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. Nelson had looked at me like I was the outsider, like I was the one who didn't belong, and maybe, in David's world, that was true. I pulled into an empty parking lot outside a grocery store and stared blankly at the neon signs flickering in the darkness. I had no idea how long I sat there. Minutes? An hour? Time felt irrelevant. All I could think about was how blind I had been, how naive, how utterly foolish I must have looked to everyone who knew. Because someone had to know. David's coworkers, his friends, even his family maybe. The thought made my stomach churn. How many of them had smiled at me, made small talk, pretended like everything was normal while they knew my husband was screwing someone else? How many of them had looked at me with pity, thinking, God, if only she knew. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel, the sharp sound echoing through the car. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. I wanted to erase the past 8 years of my life and pretend this wasn't real. But I couldn't. This was my life. And the worst part? David wasn't even sorry. Not really. Sure, he looked guilty, he looked tired, he looked like a man whose secrets had finally caught up to him. But guilt and regret weren't the same thing. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was sorry that I had found out. I inhaled sharply, forcing the air into my lungs. I couldn't sit here forever. I needed to go home and face him. When I finally walked through the front door, David was sitting on the couch, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He looked up the second I stepped inside, his bloodshot eyes searching my face. Where were you? I didn't answer. I walked past him, dropped my purse on the table, and exhaled slowly. You need to leave. His body tensed. Rachel, I don't want to hear it. My voice came out sharper than I expected, but I didn't care. Pack your things and get out. He stood slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Where am I supposed to go? A bitter laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. Maybe Nelson will take you in. David flinched, and for a moment, something flickered in his expression. Guilt maybe, or shame. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same infuriating look of exhaustion he had been wearing since the moment I confronted him. Like he was the one suffering. Like he was the one who had been betrayed. I didn't want it to happen like this, he said quietly. Like what? I snapped. You didn't want me to find out? You didn't want to deal with the consequences? You didn't want to admit that you've been lying to my face for almost a decade? He let out a slow breath. I didn't want to hurt you. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. 8 years, David. You hurt me every single day for 8 years. Silent. I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. And you weren't going to stop, were you? His jaw tightened. Were you? I demanded. David looked away. That was all the answer I needed. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I turned away from him, pressing my fingertips against my temples. This was pointless. Talking to him was pointless. He wasn't going to say the one thing I wanted to hear. The truth. I exhaled shakily. You don't even know what you want, do you? He hesitated. I love you. A hollow laugh escaped my lips. No, you don't. You don't get to say that. I do. His voice was desperate now, pleading. Rachel, I do love you. This wasn't about us. Don't, I snapped. Don't try to justify it. Don't tell me you love me and expect me to believe it. He took a step forward, but I lifted a hand. Stop. My voice was shaking now, but I refused to let him see how much this was breaking me. You made your choice, David. Now I'm making mine. You need to leave. David swallowed hard. I can't just disappear, Rachel. We built a life together. No, I said coldly. I built a life. You just used me while you did whatever the hell you wanted. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. I shook my head. I don't want to see you anymore. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want you in this house. He didn't move. Leave. David clenched his jaw, exhaled through his nose, then finally turned and walked toward the stairs. I didn't follow. I didn't want to see him pack his things, didn't want to listen to the sound of drawers opening and closing, the quiet zip of a suitcase being filled with the remnants of our life together. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, placed my hands on the counter, and took the deepest breath I could manage. My entire body felt like it was on fire, my chest tight, my stomach churning. I wanted to collapse onto the floor and sob until there was nothing left inside me. But I didn't. I stood there unmoving while David packed his bags. 20 minutes later, he walked into the kitchen, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He lingered in the doorway, watching me. "I'll stay at a hotel for now." I nodded. I didn't look at him. Long pause, then quietly he said, "For what it's worth, I never wanted to lose you." I finally turned, meeting his gaze with a stare so steady it surprised even me. "You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough." David looked like he wanted to say something else, but he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked out the door. The second it closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath and looked around the empty kitchen. The house felt different now, lighter, almost, emptier. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe. The first few days after David left felt surreal. The house was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to acknowledge what had happened. But I wasn't ready. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, avoiding the spaces that reminded me of him. Our bedroom, the living room couch where we used to curl up together, the kitchen where we had shared countless meals. I told myself that I needed time to process, to grieve, but deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't grieving him. I was grieving the version of my life that never really existed. I refused to let myself fall apart. If David had spent 8 years treating me like a fool, I wasn't going to waste another second mourning him. Instead, I forced myself into action. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. Sitting across from her in a sleek office downtown, I laid everything out. The affair, the secret emails, the hidden bank transactions. She listened, nodding occasionally, taking notes in a crisp leather notebook. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "You have options," she said, "but the most important thing right now is making sure you're protected financially." I swallowed, my throat dry. "David handled most of our finances." Her expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of something in her eyes, recognition. She had seen this before. "Then we'll need to do a deep dive. Bank accounts, investments, property titles. If he's been keeping secrets, there's a good chance some of them involve money." The thought made my stomach turn. David had already stolen years of my life. Had he been stealing my security too? By the time I left the office, my hands were shaking, but I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. I went home and started digging. I pulled out old bank statements, scoured our shared accounts, checked every transaction for anything that felt off. At first, nothing jumped out at me. Then I noticed the transfers. Small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there, but over time they added up to tens of thousands of dollars. And they weren't going to any account I recognized. I stared at the numbers, my pulse pounding. Where had the money gone? There was only one way to find out. I called David. He didn't answer. I didn't expect him to. Instead, I texted him a screenshot of the transactions with a single message. "Where is this money?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. A minute later, my phone rang. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello?" David exhaled sharply. "Rachel, look. Don't waste my time. Just tell me where the money is." A pause. Then reluctantly, he said, "It's in a separate account." I gritted my teeth. "Whose name is on it?" "Mine," he admitted. The betrayal hit me all over again, sharp and suffocating. "So, you've been siphoning off money from our accounts for years?" "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "I wasn't stealing from you. I needed a backup." I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "A backup? For what? In case I finally figured out you were a liar?" He hesitated. I didn't want to be stuck if things fell apart. I closed my eyes, inhaling through my nose, transfer it back. "Rachel, I'm not asking." My voice was calm, but my hands were clenched into fists. "If you don't transfer every single dollar back into our account by the end of the day, my lawyer will be filing for asset investigation first thing tomorrow, and if you've spent any of it, I will come for everything." Silence. Then, quietly, "Fine." The line went dead. I set my phone down and stared at the wall. The anger I felt wasn't just about the money, it was about what it represented. David had never planned on staying, not really. He had been hedging his bets, making sure he had a way out. even while he was lying to me, making me believe we were building a future together. I wouldn't let him win. I spent the next few days preparing for war. I met with my lawyer again. I made copies of every document, every receipt, every piece of evidence that proved David had been hiding things from me. I started the process of separating our finances, removing his name from anything that tied him to my future. And then I did something for myself. I went to the gym for the first time in years. At first, I felt ridiculous standing there in my old leggings and oversized sweatshirt, surrounded by people who looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. But I pushed through. I ran until my legs ached, lifted weights until my arms trembled. With every drop of sweat, I felt a little stronger, a little more like the woman I used to be before David broke me down. I cut my hair. I booked a solo trip. I started reclaiming my life. And as I sat in my lawyer's office, finalizing the paperwork that would legally sever me from the man who had betrayed me, I realized something. David had spent years making me feel small. But now, I was the one in control. David thought he could walk away from this unscathed. He thought he could lie, steal, betray me for years and still somehow land on his feet. That was the thing about men like him. They believed they were untouchable. They believed that no matter how much damage they caused, they would always be forgiven, always be given another chance, always be able to manipulate their way back into the life they had ruined. He was wrong. The money was the first thing I took from him. He had wired it back into our account after my ultimatum, but I wasn't done. I worked with my lawyer to freeze our shared assets before he could try anything else, then began the process of untangling our finances completely. He fought me on that, of course. Called, texted, sent long-winded emails about how we could figure this out together. I ignored every single one. The next thing I took from him was his reputation. I hadn't planned on it at first. I had told myself that I just wanted to get away from him, that I didn't care what happened to him once I was free. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized. He had spent years making a fool out of me. He had lied to me, humiliated me, stolen from me, and the worst part, he had never even looked back. He had walked out of our house and into his new life without so much as a real apology. So I made sure everyone knew the truth. It started small, a conversation with one of his coworkers' wives, a casual mention of our messy divorce and the multiple affairs that led to it. She went pale, eyes widening, and within a week the news had spread through his entire company. I heard from a mutual friend that people had started looking at him differently, that some of his female colleagues refused to speak to him, that his boss, a conservative man with a zero-tolerance policy for workplace scandals, had called him into his office for a discussion. Next, I made sure his friends knew, or rather the people he considered his friends. They were mostly married couples we had socialized with over the years, people who had been at our wedding, at our dinner parties, at our holidays. I sent out a message in our group chat, one I had never left, despite everything. Hey everyone, just wanted to update you, David and I are finalizing the divorce. Turns out he was cheating for 8 years with multiple people, including someone he's still seeing now. I hope you all understand why I won't be attending any future gatherings where he's present. I muted the chat and didn't look at it for hours. When I finally checked, it had exploded. Messages from the other wives, all horrified. Some of them admitted they had suspected something was off but had never said anything. A few of the men defended David, saying relationships were complicated, but they were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming support for me. Then came the final blow. I had been holding on to the emails, the messages I had found between David and Nelson, the receipts, the screenshots. I had never sent them to anyone, never posted them, never used them, but I knew David had been lying to Nelson just as much as he had lied to me. I had seen the messages where David had promised him things, told him he was different, said he was planning to leave me for him. So I sent them, not publicly, not as some grand act of revenge, but directly to Nelson himself. A simple email with no subject, just the screenshots attached. No explanation, no warning. It took less than an hour for David to call me. What the hell did you do? His voice was raw, panicked. I smiled. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games, Rachel. His breathing was uneven. You sent him the messages. I did. Silence. Then, he left me. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. Good. David made a sound, half a laugh, half a sob. You really wanted to ruin me, didn't you? I thought about that for a moment. No, I just wanted you to finally deal with the consequences of your actions. He was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice so small I barely recognized it, he whispered, I don't know what to do. For the first time in a long time, I felt nothing for him. No sympathy, no pity, no anger, just nothing. That's not my problem, I said and hung up. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone, waiting to feel something, but all I felt was relief. I had won. I thought that when it was all over, I would feel empty. That once the dust settled and David was finally out of my life, I would be left with nothing but the wreckage of a marriage that had never been real to begin with. But as I sat in my quiet house, drinking coffee on a morning that felt like any other, I realized something. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I wasn't ruined. I was free. David had always been a shadow over my life, a presence I hadn't even realized was weighing me down until it was gone. The silence in the house wasn't loneliness, it was peace. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop, no more questioning if I was imagining things, no more sharing a space with someone who had been lying to me for nearly a decade. I had spent the past few weeks rebuilding myself, piece by piece. My lawyer had finalized the divorce papers and I had signed them without hesitation. David, from what I had heard, was struggling. Nelson had cut him off completely. His friends had distanced themselves, and work had suddenly become a much less welcoming place for him. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, to revel in the destruction of his carefully built facade, but I didn't. Because the truth was, I didn't care anymore. The person I used to be, the woman who cried over him, who spent years trying to be good enough, who begged for his love without realizing she had never really had it, that version of me no longer existed. And I wasn't mourning her, I was celebrating her absence. I had started going out again, not on dates, not yet, but with friends, with people who actually valued me, who saw me. I laughed more, I slept better. I filled my time with things I had once put aside for him, for our marriage. I had picked up an old hobby I'd abandoned years ago, painting, and let myself lose hours mixing colors and creating something that was mine, something untouched by him. And then one evening, as I was sitting on my balcony watching the sun set, my phone buzzed. David. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, hello. He was quiet at first. Then, in a tired voice, he said, I signed the papers. I nodded to myself. Good. More silence. Then, are you happy? The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I realized he had never once truly asked me that in all the years we were together. He had never cared enough to wonder. But now, when everything was over, when I had nothing left to give him, now he wanted to know. I smiled to myself, feeling the weight of it all lift from my shoulders. Yeah, I said, I really am. And for the first time in years, I truly meant it.